Usually, I mean, a massive industrial conglomerate like Volkswagen, it just feels permanent, you know?
Right. It's an institution.
Exactly. You look at the German economic landscape, and VW is simply this foundational pillar. Like, it's always been there.
Yeah, you just assume something of that size is pretty much immune to any sudden shifts.
Right. But this week, that pillar cracked. We're looking at an economic reality across Europe that is basically fracturing right down the middle. And today, we have two genuinely shocking pieces of news to explore with you.
Very shocking.
First, Volkswagen is threatening to close domestic factories for the first time in its 87-year history.
Which is huge.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And second, the UK economy just flatlined in January 2026, like absolutely 0% growth.
Yeah. So you basically have two major, highly complex economies experiencing two completely different profiles of crisis simultaneously.
Right.
One is the sort of slow-moving industrial rot, and the other is just a sudden, violent paralysis.
Which is exactly what we're going to get into. Our stack of sources today includes some incredible on-the-ground reporting from both Germany and the UK, plus, surprisingly, an advanced macroeconomic textbook.
A bit of light reading.
Right. But we're taking the pristine theoretical models from those textbook pages and crashing them right into the messy reality of global politics.
Yeah, seeing where the theory breaks down.
Exactly. Our mission today is to decode exactly why Europe's biggest economic engines are stalling out, the mechanical failure of the policies that are supposedly meant to fix them, and most importantly, what this actually means for your own wallet.
Because it always trickles down.
It really does. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the sheer scale of the situation over in Germany.
Yeah, we are looking at numbers here that go way, way beyond just a bad quarterly earnings report.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, Volkswagen needs 10 billion euros in cost savings over the next 3 years.
10 billion. That's just, wow.
Yeah. And to get there, they've formally terminated a job security deal with their unions that had been like ironclad for 3 decades.
30 years of protection just gone.
Gone. And that opens the door for compulsory redundancies, massive job losses, and honestly, the potential shutdown of entire assembly lines.
Right. And compounding all that misery in the auto sector, BMW just announced a recall of 1.5 million vehicles.
Yeah, which instantly wiped 11% off their share price.
Just brutal. But I have to push back a little on the broader narrative here, though.
Okay, sure.
Because I'm reading the reports about VW's faltering electric vehicle strategy, right?
Yeah.
And they arguably botched their EV rollout.
They definitely had some missteps there, yeah.
So is this really a macroeconomic crisis, or is VW just suffering from terrible corporate management? Like, is VW just the canary in the coal mine for a much deeper disease in the whole 4.2 trillion euro German economy?
That's the perfect question. And the answer is, well, the management missteps at VW definitely accelerated their specific pain, but the macroeconomic indicators show the entire engine is sputtering.
The whole thing.
Right. Germany's industrial production in July of this year was almost 10% below its level at the start of 2023.
Wow.
And this is a continuous 6-year downward trend. It's not a blip. The textbook actually identifies the specific threat facing these auto workers as structural unemployment.
Structural unemployment, so not just a temporary layoff.
Exactly. This isn't a temporary dip where people lose jobs just because consumers are briefly tightening their belts. Structural unemployment is insidious. It's a permanent shift.
Right, because the whole foundation moved.
Yeah, it's what happens when the skills of the workforce no longer match what the global economy is actually willing to buy. Or, when the fundamental cost of doing business just forces entire industries to pack up and leave.
And the forces driving them to leave are completely undeniable right now. I mean, Germany's industrial dominance was essentially built on a very specific foundation, cheap Russian gas.
Yep, that was the bedrock.
And the loss of that energy pipeline following the invasion of Ukraine, it wasn't just a temporary disruption. It basically permanently destroyed the viability of energy-intensive manufacturing in that region.
It completely changed the math.
It did. And then you add in the flood of heavily subsidized, low-cost Chinese EVs entering the European market, and the math for domestic production it just stops working.
It really represents a fundamental collapse in the country's capacity to produce wealth.
Yeah.
I mean, Germany's GDP contracted by 0.3% in 2023.
Negative growth.
Yeah, and the leading economic institutes are projecting 0% growth for 2024.
Jeez.
For an economy that enjoyed a whole decade of unbroken expansion before the pandemic, hitting a wall of zero growth is mathematically devastating.
Right.
In textbook macroeconomic terms, their physical capacity to produce has hit a hard ceiling, and it's actively shrinking.
So if Germany is suffocating from this slow, decade-long structural decline, the UK is showing us what happens when a fragile system takes a sudden, violent hit to the chest.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, let's pivot to that January 2026 UK data. We are seeing the same headline, right? 0% overall growth, but the internal numbers are wild.
They're all over the place.
There's a massive 2.7% drop in food and drink service activities in a single month.
Just plummeted.
People are they're too anxious to eat out. But I'm struggling to see how a single geopolitical event guts the hospitality sector that fast. Like, are fuel costs really eating up that much disposable income overnight?
They absolutely are. And it happens through this brutal chain reaction across the entire supply chain.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, we know UK consumer demand was already on shaky ground, right?
Yeah.
But then the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran triggered an immediate severe energy shock.
Right, the prices just spiked.
Exactly. Fuel costs spiked at the petrol pump, and the cost of commercial heating oil just surged. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the textbook uses the and-S model, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. An energy shock acts as a massive, unavoidable tax on almost every business in the country simultaneously.
Because of the cost of moving anything or, even just keeping the lights on in a warehouse, it skyrockets.
Precisely. The aggregate supply curve violently shifts left.
Meaning everything gets harder to make.
Yeah. The restaurant owner suddenly pays 30% more to heat their dining room. They pay 30% more for the diesel required to deliver their produce.
Right.
And they pay more for the ingredients themselves because the farms are also paying higher energy costs.
It's just compounding at every step.
Exactly. So to survive, that restaurant has to raise menu prices while simultaneously cutting staff hours to save money. Multiply that across the entire country, and you get what the textbook defines as stagflation.
Stagflation, the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, it's a contraction of growth and inflation at the same time. The physical capacity of the economy shrinks, which halts growth, while the cost of producing everything goes up, driving inflation.
It's a dual-front war for the consumer, really. I mean, they get hit with higher utility bills at home. They look at the suddenly inflated price of a pint and a burger, and they just instantly pull back.
Yeah, they stay home.
The demand vanishes out of sheer financial self-preservation. And naturally, when an economy paralyzes like this, the political theater just kicks into high gear.
Oh, of course.
We're seeing Chancellor Rachel Reeves aggressively defending her economic plan, claiming labor is cutting the cost of living and, laying the groundwork for growth. Meanwhile, Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride is hammering the data, stating Labour's economic mismanagement left the UK completely exposed to this kind of shock. But regardless of the political rhetoric flying across the aisle, and we're not endorsing either side here, the mathematical reality of this stagflation is what actually dictates the next move.
And that mathematical reality has completely trapped the Bank of England.
Because their usual tools don't work anymore.
Exactly. Normally, if an economy stalls out and shows zero growth, a central bank's textbook response is to cut interest rates.
Make money cheaper.
Yeah, making borrowing cheaper encourages businesses to invest and consumers to spend, which jumpstarts the engine. But because this stagnation is paired with an inflation spike driven by the energy shock, they can't do that.
Right, because cutting interest rates when prices are already surging, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. If they cut rates to try and save the hospitality sector or the housing market, they risk sending everyday grocery and fuel inflation spiraling completely out of control.
So they're just stuck.
They are paralyzed. They're widely expected to hold interest rates painfully steady, which basically forces everyday consumers to just absorb the blow.
Which brings us to the supposed solutions. Because if central banks are trapped by inflation and economies are bleeding out their industrial capacity, governments usually turn to what the textbook calls supply-side policies.
Right, the long-term fixes.
Yeah, and the textbook separates these into market-oriented policies, deregulation, tax cuts, and interventionist policies.
Which is the big government spending.
Exactly. Massive direct government spending on infrastructure and technology. The goal of the interventionist approach is to literally build a bigger, more efficient economic engine, right? Shift the potential output.
Yeah, shift that long-run aggregate supply curve to the right.
Right. So if you upgrade a country's rail network or you transition their power grid to cheaper renewables, every business suddenly operates faster and cheaper.
And on paper, Germany is executing this interventionist playbook very aggressively.
Or at least they say they are.
Right. Well, they allocated 20 billion euros in subsidies specifically to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing backing facilities for tech giants like Intel and TSMC.
Okay, 20 billion, not bad.
But the crown jewel of this strategy was supposed to be the SVI.
Ah, the SVI.
Yes, the Special Fund for Infrastructure and Climate Neutrality. This was a staggering 500 billion euro debt-financed fund.
€500 billion.
$500 billion, and it was designed to completely modernize the nation's physical capital.
I mean, it sounds like the ultimate economic defibrillator. But the reality check from the IFO and IW Economic Research Institutes is just, it's staggering.
It really is.
They analyzed the deployment of those SVIK funds, and they found that between 86 and 95% of that 500 billion euro infrastructure fund was diverted.
Poof.
God.
They didn't build the infrastructure.
No, they didn't.
Wait, so let me get this straight. That is the equivalent of taking out a massive 30-year mortgage, supposedly to put a new roof on your house and upgrade the plumbing?
Yep.
But the second the bank clears the check, you just use the cash to pay off your daily credit card bills and buy groceries.
That is exactly what happened. And the economic consequences of running that kind of shell game at a sovereign level are catastrophic.
I can only imagine. The IFO Institute tracked the money. While borrowing from this special fund increased the national debt by over 24 billion euros in a specific window, actual federal investments into physical assets only rose by 1.3 billion.
Wow. So they just took money legally earmarked for future modernization and dumped it into the general budget to cover current operational costs, like pensions, welfare, daily administrative bloat.
Pretty much, yeah. They faked the investment.
That's insane.
They burned the balance sheet without expanding the economy's capacity. And the Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, issued a highly critical warning about this exact maneuver.
Because you can't pay it back.
Right. The textbook principle here is that taking on national debt is only sustainable if you are buying assets that generate future growth.
Like the high-speed rail line.
Exactly. If you build a rail line, commerce moves faster, GDP goes up, and the resulting increase in tax revenue pays off the debt over time.
But if you just spend the borrowed billions on daily operating expenses, you still owe the massive debt, but you haven't built any new wealth-generating capacity to pay for it.
You're just in a deeper hole.
You're handing the next generation a massive mortgage bill, but leaving them with a house that still has a leaking roof and rotting plumbing.
And Chancellor Friedrich Merz is facing a firestorm of criticism over this exact misallocation. It is a fundamental betrayal of the entire concept of interventionist policy.
So it forces us to ask why. Why would a government resort to accounting tricks rather than just legally funding their day-to-day budget and executing the infrastructure projects as promised?
Right. Why the smoke and mirrors?
Which exposes the massive friction between textbook economics and political survival. Because Germany has a constitutional debt break, don't they?
They do, yes.
It strictly limits annual structural budget deficits to 0.35% of GDP.
Which is an incredibly tight fiscal straitjacket.
Right. They simply aren't allowed to borrow mass amounts of money for general budget stimulus.
So they're trapped. They can't use traditional fiscal stimulus to buy their way out of the slump. They diverted the infrastructure funds to hide the budget gaps, but now the industrial rot is just accelerating.
Because nothing got fixed.
Exactly. And according to the textbook, if a country cannot spend its way out of structural stagnation, it must turn to the other half of the supply-side equation, which is market-oriented policies.
And this is where the textbook becomes politically toxic.
Very toxic.
Because market-oriented policies require the government to basically get out of the way to force competitiveness. We're talking about reducing corporate taxes, stripping away labor protections, eliminating minimum wages.
Yeah, slashing unemployment benefits.
Right, to physically force a reluctant labor pool into lower-paying jobs. And our sources point this out. Suda David Wilp from the German Marshall Fund mapped out exactly why this isn't happening.
Successive German governments have known for years that these painful structural reforms are mathematically necessary to compete with China and the U.S., but they absolutely refuse to touch them.
Because market-oriented reforms practically guarantee severe short-term financial pain for the working class, all in exchange for, like, theoretical long-term economic stability.
And a populace experiencing immediate financial pain votes out the incumbent government.
Exactly. We see this exact dynamic fueling the rise of the far-right Alternative for Germany, or AfD party.
Right.
And to look at this purely through an analytical lens, without taking a side, the established political coalition sees the textbook demanding they cut social safety nets to lower the cost of doing business. But they know if they strip those protections while inflation is high, voters will flock to the populist fear-mongering of the AfD.
It's a catch-22.
It really is. So established politicians choose the path of least resistance. They avoid the painful market reforms, they run a shell game with the infrastructure funds to keep the daily social programs afloat, and the foundational industrial rot just continues to spread.
Yeah, because a textbook model doesn't have to worry about a populist uprising or an upcoming election cycle.
Right, it's just numbers on a page.
It just demands mathematical efficiency. The failure to reconcile those theoretical demands with the reality of human anxiety is exactly why these economies are stalling.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. This isn't the first time Germany has faced this exact crisis.
No, it's not.
In the late 90s and early 2000s, their economy was so stagnant, they were famously dubbed the quote-unquote sick man of Europe.
Yeah, that was the big label.
And they eventually forced through the Hartz reforms, which were a series of brutal, highly unpopular labor market deregulations.
They're really painful at the time.
Right. It cost politicians their careers, but it successfully fueled the next 20 years of German industrial dominance. Yet, current leadership is aggressively rejecting that historical parallel.
They don't want to hear it.
Not at all. Finance Minister Christian Lindner recently went to the World Economic Forum and flatly denied the sick man label. He claimed Germany is just a tired man in need of a good cup of coffee.
A cup of coffee.
Yeah, in the form of mild structural tweaks.
I mean, calling a decade of declining competitiveness and a structural energy crisis a tired man needing coffee is just, it's a dangerous minimization.
It's absurd, honestly.
A cup of coffee fixes a mid-afternoon slump. A 10 billion euro shortfall at your flagship automaker and a total loss of cheap energy requires an entirely new operational model.
Right. It requires deep, invasive surgery. And right now, nobody in the political operating room is willing to pick up the scalpel.
They're just arguing over the anesthesia.
Exactly. So let's bring it back to you. What does this all mean for you? Why does a macroeconomic debate about the UK's hospitality sector or Germany's debt break matter to your daily life?
Because it always does.
Because these massive, slow-moving tectonic plates eventually dictate the reality right at your kitchen table.
Yeah.
If you are sitting in the UK right now, desperate for your mortgage rate to drop so you can afford to move or refinance, you are caught in the crossfire. Your central bank is trapped holding those rates painfully high because a geopolitical energy shock halfway across the world shifted the entire supply capacity of your country.
And if you're a worker in manufacturing or technology or services, you're navigating a landscape where the skills that guaranteed you a job 5 years ago might be structurally obsolete tomorrow.
It's moving that fast.
It is. Understanding the difference between a government deploying a short-term political band-aid and actual tangible economic investment, that's how you protect your own financial future.
Right. When politicians announce billion-euro funds and promise painless growth, you have to look at the math.
Always look at the math.
If they aren't physically putting shovels in the ground, laying fiber optics, or building sustainable power grids, the growth is an illusion.
Yeah, true economic expansion requires building actual physical and human capital, not just shifting debt around a spreadsheet to cover up yesterday's obligations.
Exactly.
It requires enduring the friction of change to build a system that actually works in the modern global reality.
And that leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought drawn from the very end of the macroeconomic textbook we've been using today.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, buried in the back pages, like way past the models that politicians love to quote, is a section explicitly dedicated to the negative consequences of economic growth.
Which nobody talks about.
Nobody. It details how the relentless textbook pursuit of endless GDP expansion actively drives environmental depletion, resource scarcity, and the exact kind of structural unemployment we are seeing today as corporations mercilessly abandon workers in the name of global efficiency. We sit here and analyze Europe's panic as they bend over backward to keep the growth line moving up amidst energy crises and political gridlock. But perhaps, as we watch these massive economic engines tear themselves apart trying to maintain the impossible, maybe the real question isn't how to force the line to keep going up. Maybe our obsession with infinite, unbroken growth on a finite planet is actually the disease itself.
It really challenges the core assumption of modern policy. I mean, what does a healthy, stable society even look like if we stop treating a period of 0% growth as an automatic existential catastrophe?
It's something to mull over the next time a politician promises to permanently revitalize the economy with a quick cup of coffee.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Whether you're watching the factory floor at Volkswagen or the menu prices at your local pub, we hope we've given you a sharper lens to view the headlines through. Keep questioning the math and keep looking for the reality behind the rhetoric.